The Vietnam War, lasting from November 1st, 1955 to April 30th, 1975, was an armed conflict in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia fought between North Vietnam, officially known as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, and South Vietnam, the Republic of Vietnam, along with their respective allies. North Vietnam was supported by the Soviet Union and China, while South Vietnam was supported by the United States and other anti-communist nations. The conflict was the second of the Indochina Wars and a proxy war of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and United States. The Vietnam War was simultaneously one of the post-colonial wars of national liberation, a theater in the Cold War, and a civil war, with civil warfare being a defining feature from the outset. Direct United States military involvement escalated from 1965 until its withdrawal in 1973. The fighting spilled into the Laotian and Cambodian civil wars, which ended with all three countries becoming communist in 1975. After the defeat of the French Union in the First Indochina War that began in 1946, Vietnam gained independence in the 1954 Geneva Conference, but was divided in two at the 17th parallel. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, took control of North Vietnam, while the United States assumed financial and military support for South Vietnam, led by Ngo Dinh Diem. The North Vietnamese supplied and directed the Viet Cong, a common front of dissidents in the South, which intensified a guerrilla war from 1957. In 1958, North Vietnam invaded Laos, establishing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to supply the Viet Cong. By 1963, the North had covertly sent 40,000 soldiers of its People's Army of Vietnam, armed with Soviet and Chinese weapons, to fight in the insurgency in the South. President John F. Kennedy increased United States involvement from 700 military advisors in 1960 to 16,000 in 1963, and sent more aid to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which failed to produce results. In 1963, Diem was killed in a United States-backed military coup, which added to the South's instability. Following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, the United States Congress passed a resolution that gave President Lyndon B. Johnson authority to increase military presence without declaring war. Johnson launched a bombing campaign of the North and sent combat troops, dramatically increasing deployment to 84,000 by 1966 and 536,000 by 1969. United States forces relied on air supremacy and overwhelming firepower to conduct search and destroy operations in rural areas. In 1968, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, which was a tactical defeat but convinced many Americans the war could not be won. Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, began Vietnamization from 1969, which saw the conflict fought by an expanded Army of the Republic of Vietnam, while United States forces withdrew. The 1970 Cambodian coup d'etat resulted in a People's Army of Vietnam invasion and United States Army of the Republic of Vietnam counterinvasion, escalating Cambodia's civil war. United States troops had mostly withdrawn from Vietnam by 1972, and the 1973 Paris Peace Accords saw the rest leave. The accords were broken, and fighting continued until the 1975 Spring Offensive and fall of Saigon to the People's Army of Vietnam, marking the war's end. North and South Vietnam were reunified in 1976. The war exacted an enormous cost, with estimates of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians killed ranging from 970,000 to 3 million. Some 275,000 to 300,000 Cambodians, 20,000 to 62,000 Laotians, and 58,220 United States service members died. Its end would precipitate the Vietnamese boat people crisis and the larger Indochina refugee crisis, which saw millions leave Indochina, of which about 250,000 perished at sea. 20% of South Vietnam's jungle was sprayed with toxic herbicides, which led to significant health problems. The Khmer Rouge carried out the Cambodian genocide, and the Cambodian-Vietnamese War began in 1978. In response, China invaded Vietnam, with border conflicts lasting until 1991. Within the United States, the war gave rise to Vietnam Syndrome, an aversion to American overseas military involvement, which, along with the Watergate scandal, contributed to the crisis of confidence that affected America throughout the 1970s. Various names have been applied and shifted over time, though Vietnam War is the most commonly used in English. It has been called the Second Indochina War since it spread to Laos and Cambodia, the Vietnam conflict, and colloquially, Nam. In Vietnam, it is known as the Resistance War against Americas. The government of Vietnam officially refers to it as the Resistance War against America to save the nation. Vietnam had been under French control as part of French Indochina since the 1880s. Vietnamese independence movements, such as the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, faced suppression despite growing public support for diverse reformist and revolutionary nationalist causes. Nguyen Sinh Khong established the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930. The Marxist-Leninist Party aimed to overthrow French rule and establish a communist state. Fractures between nationalists and communists emerged in the 1920s, as the two groups differed in their visions for post-colonial Vietnam, republicanism for the revolutionary nationalists, and proletarian internationalism for the communists. The communists' radical push for centralized control led to a prolonged civil conflict marked by the suppression of rival nationalists, with the Indochinese Communist Party largely responsible for initiating systematic on-Vietnamese violence. In 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, following France's capitulation to Germany. By 1941, Japan had gained full military access across Indochina and established a dual colonial rule that preserved Vichy French administration while facilitating Japanese military operations. Khong, now known as Ho Chi Minh, returned to establish the anti-Japanese Viet Minh movement. From 1944, the United States Office of Strategic Services provided the Viet Minh with weapons and training to fight the occupying Japanese. United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt supported Vietnamese resistance and proposed Vietnam's independence be granted under an international trusteeship after the war. The Viet Minh secured their advantage by relocating their operations from southern China into Vietnam and leveraging Allied support. In March 1945, Japan, losing the war, overthrew the French government in Indochina, established the Empire of Vietnam, and maintained Emperor Bao Dai as a figurehead. Nationalist parties expanded their political influence. Following the surrender of Japan, the Viet Minh launched the August Revolution, overthrowing the Japanese-backed state and seizing weapons from the surrendering Japanese forces. On September 2nd, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. However, British and French forces arrived in Indochina to oversee the Japanese surrender south of the 16th parallel, while Chinese nationalist troops did so in the north. On September 23rd, the British supported a French coup that overthrew the Democratic Republic of Vietnam government in Saigon and reinstated French control. American support for the Viet Minh ended, and Office of Strategic Services forces left as the French sought to reassert control. Beginning in August 1945, the Viet Minh sought to consolidate power by terrorizing and purging rival Vietnamese nationalist groups and Trotskyist activists. In 1946, the Franco-Chinese and Ho Sang Thanh agreements facilitated a coexistence between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and French that strengthened the Viet Minh while undermining the nationalists. That summer, the Viet Minh colluded with French forces to eliminate nationalists, targeted for their ardent anti-colonialism. With most of the nationalist partisans defeated and negotiations broken down, tensions between the Viet Minh and French authorities erupted into full-scale war in December 1946, a conflict which became entwined with the Cold War. Surviving nationalist partisans and politico-religious groups rallied behind the exiled Bao Dai to reopen negotiations with France in opposition to communist domination. While the state of Vietnam, under Bao Dai as chief of state, aligned with the anti-communist Western Bloc, The French exploited it to extend their colonial presence and to bolster their standing within NATO. By adhering to Marxist-Leninist principles, Vietnamese communists monopolized power through a series of radical campaigns. The anti-communist Truman Doctrine, first announced by President Harry S. Truman in March 1947, pledged United States support to nations resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. After Communist China and the Soviet Union recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the United States recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam, based in Saigon, as the legitimate government in February 1950. The outbreak of the Korean War in June convinced Washington policymakers that the war in Indochina was another example of communist expansionism directed by the Soviet Union. Military advisors from China began assisting the Viet Minh in July 1950. Chinese weapons, expertise, and laborers transformed the Viet Minh from a guerrilla force into an army. In September 1950, the United States created the Military Assistance Advisory Group to screen French aid requests, advise on strategy, and train Vietnamese soldiers. By 1954, the United States had spent $1 billion supporting the French military effort, representing 80% of the cost of the war. The decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu was lost by the French, who signed the Geneva Accords on July 21, 1954. As part of the accords, the French agreed to withdraw from northern Vietnam and to allow Ho Chi Minh's forces to relocate there, while the southern zone was placed under the control of Emperor Bio Mio Mio. A line of demarcation was drawn at the 17th parallel, north of which the forces of the Viet Minh would hold sway. Free passage of civilians across the temporary demarcation line was permitted until 1955, and elections to reunite the country were planned for 1956. The accords mandated that the two countries disarm and hold a general election so that Vietnam could have one central government. In 1954 and 1955, there was a mass migration of approximately 1 million Northerners, mainly Catholics, to South Vietnam in Operation Passage to Freedom, assisted by the French Navy and United States 7th Fleet to ferry refugees. The refugees gave the later Ngo Dinh Diem regime a strong anti-communist constituency. Over 100,000 Viet Minh fighters went north for regroupment, expecting to return south within 2 years. The Viet Minh left roughly 5,000 to 10,000 cadres in the south as a base for insurgency. The last French soldiers left South Vietnam in 1956, and China withdrew from North Vietnam. Between 1953 and 1956, the northern government instituted agrarian reforms, including rent reduction and land reform, which resulted in political oppression. During land reform, North Vietnamese witnesses suggested a ratio of 1 execution for every 160 village residents, about 100,000 executions. As the campaign was mainly in the Red River Delta, 50,000 executions became accepted by scholars. However, documents from Vietnamese and Hungarian archives indicate executions were much lower, though likely greater than 13,500. In 1956, leaders in Hanoi admitted to excesses and restored much of the land to the original owners. The South, meanwhile, constituted the state of Vietnam, with Bao Dai as emperor and Ngo Dinh Diem as prime minister. Neither the United States nor Diem's state of Vietnam signed anything at the Geneva Conference. The non-communist Vietnamese delegation objected to any division of Vietnam, but lost when the French accepted the proposal of Viet Minh delegate Pham Van Dong, who proposed Vietnam be united by elections under the supervision of local commissions. The United States countered with the American plan, with the support of South Vietnam and the United Kingdom. It provided for unification elections under UN supervision, but was rejected by the Soviets. The United States said, with respect to the statement made by the representative of the state of Vietnam, the United States reiterates its traditional position that peoples are entitled to determine their own future, and that it will not join in any arrangement which would hinder this. President Eisenhower wrote in 1954, I have never talked or corresponded with a person knowledgeable in Indo-Chinese affairs who did not agree that had elections been held as of the time of the fighting, possibly 80% of the population would have voted for the communist Ho Chi Minh as their leader, rather than Chief of State Bao Dai. Indeed, the lack of leadership and drive on the part of Bao Dai was a factor in the feeling prevalent among Vietnamese that they had nothing to fight for. According to the Pentagon Papers, Diem would have been a more popular candidate than Bao Dai against Ho Chi Minh, stating, "It is almost certain that by 1956 the proportion which might have voted for Ho in a free election against Diem would have been much smaller than 80%. In 1957, independent observers from India, Poland, and Canada representing the International Control Commission stated that fair elections were impossible, reporting that neither South nor North had honored the armistice agreement. From April to June 1955, Diem eliminated political opposition in the South by launching operations against religious groups, the Sao Dai and Hua Hao of Ba Kut Teh. The campaign attacked the Binh Xuyen organized crime group, which was allied with members of the Communist Party's secret police and had military elements. The group was defeated in April following a battle in Saigon. As broad opposition to his harsh tactics mounted, Diem sought to blame the communists. In a referendum on the future of the state of Vietnam in October 1955, Diem rigged the poll supervised by his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu and was credited with 98%, including 33% in Saigon. His American advisors had recommended a more modest winning margin of 60 to 70%. Diem, however, viewed the election as a test of authority. He declared South Vietnam to be an independent state under the name Republic of Vietnam, with him as president. Likewise, Ho Chi Minh and other communists won 99% of the vote in North Vietnamese elections. The domino theory, which argued that if a country fell to communism, surrounding countries would follow, was first proposed by the Eisenhower administration. John F. Kennedy, then a senator, said, "Burma, Thailand, India, Japan, the Philippines, and obviously Laos and Cambodia are among those whose security would be threatened if the red tide of communism overflowed into Vietnam." A devout Catholic, Diem was fervently anti-communist, nationalist, and socially conservative. Diem represented narrow and extremist nationalism coupled with autocracy and nepotism. Most Vietnamese were Buddhist, and alarmed by Diem's actions, like his dedication of the country to the Virgin Mary. In 1955, Diem launched the Denounce the Communists campaign, during which suspected communists and other anti-government elements were imprisoned, tortured, or executed. He instituted the death penalty in 1956 against activity deemed communist. The North Vietnamese government claimed that, by November 1957, over 65,000 were imprisoned and 2,148 killed. 40,000 political prisoners were jailed by 1959. In October 1956, Diem launched a land reform program limiting the size of rice farms per owner. 1.8 million acres of farmland became available for purchase by landless people. By 1960, the process had stalled because many of Diem's biggest supporters were large landowners. In May 1957, Diem undertook a 10-day state visit to the United States. Eisenhower pledged his continued support, and a parade was held in Diem's honor. But Secretary of State Dulles privately conceded Diem had to be backed because they could find no better alternative. Between 1954 and 1957, the Diem government succeeded in preventing large-scale unrest in the countryside. In April 1957, insurgents launched an assassination campaign, referred to as extermination of traitors. 17 people were killed in the Shao Doc massacre and a bar in July. By early 1959, Diem had come to regard the violence as an organized campaign and implemented Law 10959, which made political violence punishable by death. There had been division among former Viet Minh, whose main goal was to hold elections promised in the Geneva Accords, leading to activities separate from the other communists and anti-government of the Republic of Vietnam activists. Douglas Pike estimated that insurgents carried out 2,000 abductions and 1,700 assassinations of officials, village chiefs, hospital workers, and teachers from 1957 to 1960. Violence between insurgents and government forces increased from 180 clashes in January 1960 to 545 in September. In September 1960, Central Office for South Vietnam, North Vietnam's southern headquarters, ordered a coordinated uprising in South Vietnam, and a third of the population was soon living in areas of communist control. In December, North Vietnam formally created the Viet Cong, with the intent of uniting all anti-government of the Republic of Vietnam insurgents, including non-communists. It was formed in Mem Ot, Cambodia, and directed through Central Office for South Vietnam. The Viet Cong placed emphasis on the withdrawal of American advisors and influence, on land reform and liberalization of the government of the Republic of Vietnam, on coalition government and the neutralization of Vietnam. Identities of the leaders were often kept secret. Support for the Viet Cong was driven by resentment of Diem's reversal of Viet Minh land reforms. The Viet Minh had confiscated large private landholdings, reduced rents and debts, and leased communal lands to poorer peasants. Diem brought the landlords back, and people who had been farming land for years had to return it and pay years of back rent. The divisions within villages reproduced those that had existed against the French: 75% support for the National Liberation Front, 20% trying to remain neutral, and 5% firmly pro-government. In March 1956, Southern Communist leader Le Duan presented a plan to revive the insurgency entitled The Road to the South, to the Politburo in Hanoi. However, as China and the Soviets opposed confrontation, his plan was rejected. Despite this, the North Vietnamese leadership approved tentative measures to revive Southern insurgency in December. Communist forces were under a single command structure set up in 1958. In May 1958, North Vietnamese forces seized the transportation hub at Thi Chepany in southern Laos, near the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese Communist Party approved a People's War on the South in January 1959, and in May, Group 5T9 was established to upgrade the Ho Chi Minh Trail, then a 6-month mountain trek through Laos. On July 8, North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao forces invaded Laos, fighting the Royal Lao Army along the border. About 500 of the regroupees of 1954 were sent south on the trail during its first year of operation. The first arms delivery was completed in August 1959. In April 1960, North Vietnam imposed military conscription for men aged 20. About 40,000 communist soldiers infiltrated the South between 1961 and 1963. In the 1960 U.S. presidential election, John F. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon. Although Eisenhower warned Kennedy about Laos and Vietnam, Europe and Latin America loomed larger than Asia on his sights. Kennedy remained committed to the Cold War foreign policy inherited from the Truman and Eisenhower administrations. In 1961, the United States had 50,000 troops based in South Korea, and Kennedy faced 4 crisis situations: the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion he had approved in April, settlement negotiations between the pro-Western government of Laos and the Pathet Lao, communist movement in May, construction of the Berlin Wall in August, and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October. Kennedy believed another failure to stop communist expansion would irreparably damage United States credibility. He was determined to draw a line in the sand and prevent a communist victory in Vietnam. He told the New York Times after the Vienna summit with Khrushchev, "Now we have a problem making our power credible, and Vietnam looks like the place." Kennedy's policy towards South Vietnam assumed Diem and his forces had to defeat the guerrillas on their own. He was against the deployment of American combat troops and observed, "To introduce U.S. forces in large numbers there today, while it might have an initially favorable military impact, would almost certainly lead to adverse political and, in the long run, adverse military consequences. The quality of the South Vietnamese military, however, remained poor. Poor leadership, corruption, and political promotions weakened the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The frequency of guerrilla attacks rose as the insurgency gathered steam. While Hanoi's support for the Viet Cong played a role, South Vietnamese governmental incompetence was at the core of the crisis. A major issue Kennedy raised was whether the Soviet space and missile programs had surpassed those of the United States. Although Kennedy stressed long-range missile parity with the Soviets, he was interested in using special forces for counterinsurgency warfare in Third World countries threatened by communist insurgencies. Although they were intended for use behind front lines after a conventional Soviet invasion of Europe, Kennedy believed guerrilla tactics employed by special forces would be effective in a brushfire war in Vietnam. Kennedy advisors Maxwell Taylor and Walt Rostow recommended United States troops be sent to South Vietnam disguised as flood relief workers. Kennedy rejected the idea but increased military assistance. In April 1962, John Kenneth Galbraith warned Kennedy of the danger we shall replace the French as a colonial force and bleed as the French did. Eisenhower put 700 advisors in Vietnam, and by November 1963, Kennedy had put 16,000. The Strategic Hamlet Program was initiated in late 1961. This joint U.S.-South Vietnamese program attempted to resettle the rural population into fortified villages. It was implemented in early 1962 and involved forced relocation and segregation of rural South Vietnamese into new communities where the peasantry would be isolated from the Viet Cong. It was hoped these new communities would provide security for the peasants and strengthen the tie between them and central government. However, by November 1963, the program had waned, and it ended in 1964. In July 1962, 14 nations, including China, South Vietnam, the Soviet Union, North Vietnam, and the United States, signed the International Agreement on the Neutrality of Laos. The inept performance of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was exemplified by failed actions such as the Battle of Ap Bac in January 1963, in which the Viet Cong won a battle against a much larger and better equipped South Vietnamese force, many of whose officers seemed reluctant to engage. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam lost 83 soldiers and 5 United States helicopters, serving to ferry troops shot down by Viet Cong forces, while the Viet Cong lost only 18 soldiers. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces were led by Diem's most trusted general, Nguyen Van Thao. Thao was a Catholic, promoted due to religion and fidelity rather than skill, and his main role was to preserve his forces to stave off coups. Washington policymakers concluded Diem was incapable of defeating the communists and might even make a deal with Ho Chi Minh. He seemed concerned only with fending off coups and had become paranoid after attempts in 1960 and 1962, which he partly attributed to United States encouragement. Robert F. Kennedy noted, Diem wouldn't make even the slightest concessions. He was difficult to reason with. Historian James Gibson summed up the situation: strategic Hamlets had failed. The South Vietnamese regime was incapable of winning the peasantry because of its class base among landlords. Indeed, there was no longer regimes in the sense of a relatively stable political alliance and functioning bureaucracy. Instead, civil government and military operations had virtually ceased. The National Liberation Front had made great progress and was close to declaring provisional revolutionary governments in large areas. Discontent with Diem's policies exploded in May 1963, following the Hue Phat Dan shootings of Buddhists protesting the ban on displaying the Buddhist flag on Vesak. This resulted in mass protests, the Buddhist crisis, against discriminatory policies that gave privileges to Catholics over the Buddhist majority. Ngo Dinh Thuc, Diem's elder brother and the Archbishop of Hue, held his anniversary celebration shortly before Vesak. They were bankrolled by the government, and Catholic flags were prominently displayed. Diem refused to make concessions to the Buddhists or take responsibility for the deaths. In August 1963, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, Special Forces of Colonel Le Quang Thanh, loyal to Diem's brother Ngo Dinh Hu, raided pagodas, causing destruction and hundreds of deaths. The Republic of Vietnam sought to harness religious nationalism by promoting spiritual values in opposition to communism's atheism. This approach amplified religious consciousness that challenged the state's authority. United States officials began discussing regime change during 1963. The United States Department of State wanted to encourage a coup, while the Pentagon favored Diem. Chief among the proposed changes was removal of Diem's brother, Ngo, who controlled the secret police and special forces, and was seen as being behind Buddhist repression and the Ngo family's rule. This proposal was conveyed to the United States Embassy in Saigon in Cable 243. The CIA contacted generals planning to remove Diem and told them the United States would not oppose this, nor punish them by cutting off aid. Diem was overthrown and executed, along with his brother, on November 10, 1963. When Kennedy was informed, Maxwell Taylor remembered he rushed from the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face. Kennedy had not anticipated Diem's murder. The U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge invited coup leaders to the embassy and congratulated them. Lodge informed Kennedy that the prospects now are for a shorter war. Kennedy wrote to Lodge congratulating him for a fine job. Following the coup, chaos ensued. Hanoi took advantage and increased its support for the Viet Cong. South Vietnam entered political instability as one military government toppled another. Each new regime was viewed by the Communists as a puppet of the Americans. Whatever the failings of Diem, his credentials as a nationalist had been impeccable. United States advisors were embedded in the South Vietnamese armed forces. They were criticized for ignoring the political nature of the insurgency. The Kennedy administration sought to refocus United States efforts on pacification, which in this case was defined as countering the insurgency and winning the hearts and minds of the population. Military leadership in Washington, however, was hostile to any role for U.S. advisors other than troop training. General Paul Harkins, the commander of U.S. forces in South Vietnam, confidently predicted victory by Christmas 1963. The CIA was less optimistic, warning that the Viet Cong by and large retained de facto control of much of the countryside and have steadily increased the overall intensity of the effort. Paramilitary officers from the CIA's Special Activities Division trained and led Hmong tribesmen in Laos and into Vietnam. The indigenous forces were in the tens of thousands and conducted direct action missions, led by paramilitary officers, against the communist Pathet Lao forces and their North Vietnamese supporters. The CIA ran the Phoenix program and participated in the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson had not been heavily involved with policy toward Vietnam, however, he immediately focused on it. On November 24, he said, "The battle against communism must be joined with strength and determination." Johnson knew he had inherited a deteriorating situation, but adhered to the widely accepted domino argument for defending the South. Should they retreat or appease, either action would imperil other nations. Findings from Rand's Viet Cong Motivation and Morale Project bolstered his confidence that an air war would weaken the insurgency. Some argue the policy of North Vietnam was not to topple other non-communist governments in Southeast Asia. The Military Revolutionary Council, meeting in lieu of a strong South Vietnamese leader, had 12 members. It was headed by General Duong Van Minh, whom journalist Stanley Carno recalled as a model of lethargy. Lodge cabled home about Minh. Will he be strong enough to get on top of things? Minh's regime was overthrown in January 1964 by General Nguyen Khanh. There was persistent instability in the military. Several coups, not all successful, occurred in a short period of time. On August 2, 1964, USS Maddox, on an intelligence mission along North Vietnam's coast, fired upon and damaged several torpedo boats approaching it in the Gulf of Tonkin. A second attack was reported 2 days later on USS Turner Joy and Maddox. The circumstances were murky. Johnson commented to Undersecretary of State George Ball that those sailors out there may have been shooting at flying fish. An NSA publication declassified in 2005 revealed there was no attack on August 4. The second attack led to retaliatory airstrikes and prompted Congress to approve the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7. This granted the President power to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. And Johnson relied on this as giving him authority to expand the war. Johnson pledged he was not committing American boys to fighting a war that I think ought to be fought by the boys of Asia to help protect their own land. The National Security Council recommended an escalation of the bombing of North Vietnam. Following an attack on a U.S. Army base in February 1965, airstrikes were initiated, while Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin was on a state visit to North Vietnam. Operation Rolling Thunder and Operation Arclight expanded aerial bombardment and ground support operations. The bombing campaign, which lasted 3 years, was intended to force North Vietnam to cease support for the Viet Cong by threatening to destroy North Vietnamese air defenses and infrastructure. It was additionally aimed at bolstering South Vietnamese morale. Between 1965 and 1968, Rolling Thunder deluged the North with 1 million tons of missiles, rockets, and bombs. Bombing was not restricted to North Vietnam. Aerial campaigns targeted different parts of the Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam infrastructure. These included the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. The ostensibly neutral Laos had become the scene of a civil war, pitting the Laotian government backed by the United States against the Pathet Lao and its North Vietnamese allies. Aerial bombardment against the Pathet Lao and People's Army of Vietnam forces was undertaken by the United States to prevent the collapse of the government and deny use of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Between 1964 and 1973, the United States dropped 2 million tons of bombs on Laos, similar to the 2.1 million tons of bombs it dropped on Europe and Asia during World War II, making Laos the most heavily bombed country in history. The objective of stopping North Vietnam and the Viet Cong was never reached. The Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force Curtis LeMay, however, had long advocated saturation bombing in Vietnam and wrote of the communists that we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age. Following the Tonkin Resolution, Hanoi anticipated the arrival of United States troops and expanded the Viet Cong, as well as sending People's Army of Vietnam personnel southwards. They were outfitting the Viet Cong forces and standardizing their equipment with AK-47 rifles and other supplies, as well as forming the 9th Division. From a strength of approximately 5,000 at the start of 1959, the Viet Cong's ranks grew to about 100,000 at the end of 1964. Between 1961-64, the Army's strength rose from about 850,000 to nearly 1 million men. United States troop numbers deployed were much lower, 2,000 in 1961, rising to 16,500 in 1964. The use of captured equipment decreased, while more ammunition and supplies were required to maintain regular units. Group 59 was tasked with expanding the Ho Chi Minh Trail in light of United States bombardment. The war had shifted into the final, conventional phase of Hanoi's 3-stage protracted warfare model. The Viet Cong was tasked with destroying the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and capturing and holding areas. However, it was not yet strong enough to assault towns and cities. In December 1964, Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces suffered serious losses at the Battle of Bin Gia, in a battle both sides viewed as a watershed. Previously, the Viet Cong had utilized hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. At Binh Gia, they defeated a strong army of the Republic of Vietnam force in a conventional battle and remained in the field for 4 days. Tellingly, South Vietnamese forces were again defeated in June 1965 at the Battle of Trung Doi. On March 8, 1965, 3,000 U.S. Marines were landed near Da Nang, South Vietnam. This marked the beginning of America's ground war. United States public opinion overwhelmingly supported the deployment. The Marines' initial assignment was defense of Da Nang Air Base. The first deployment was increased to nearly 200,000 by December. United States military had been schooled in offensive warfare. Regardless of policy, United States commanders were institutionally and psychologically unsuited to defensive missions. General William Westmoreland informed Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, Jr., commander of United States Pacific Forces, that the situation was critical. "I am convinced that U.S. troops, with their energy, mobility, and firepower, can successfully take the fight to the National Liberation Front, Viet Cong." With this recommendation, Westmoreland advocated an aggressive departure from America's defensive posture and sidelining of the South Vietnamese. By ignoring Army of the Republic of Vietnam units, the United States commitment became open-ended. Westmoreland outlined a 3-point plan to win. Phase 1 would commit United States troops to stop losing. Phase 2 would see major offensives to destroy enemy forces. And Phase 3 would involve mopping up and pacification. The plan was approved by Johnson and marked a profound departure from the insistence that South Vietnam was responsible for defeating the Viet Cong. Westmoreland predicted victory by December 1967. Johnson did not communicate this change to the media. Instead, he emphasized continuity. The change in policy depended on matching the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong in a contest of attrition and morale. The opponents were locked in an escalation cycle. However, Johnson ruled out invasion of North Vietnam due to fears of Chinese or Soviet intervention. Westmoreland and McNamara touted the body count system for gauging victory, a metric that proved flawed. The American buildup transformed the South Vietnamese economy and profoundly affected society. South Vietnam was inundated with manufactured goods. Washington encouraged its SEATO allies to contribute troops. Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and the Philippines agreed. South Korea asked to join the Many Flags program in return for economic compensation. Major allies, however, notably Canada and the United Kingdom, declined troop requests. The United States and allies mounted complex search and destroy operations. In November 1965, the United States engaged in its first major battle with the People's Army of Vietnam, the Battle of Ia Drang. The operation was the first large-scale helicopter air assault by the United States, and first to employ Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers. These tactics continued in 1966-67, however. The People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong insurgents remained elusive and demonstrated tactical flexibility. By 1967, the war had generated large-scale internal refugees, 2 million in South Vietnam, with 105,000 people evacuated and rendered homeless during Operation Masher alone, the largest search and destroy operation to that point. Operation Masher had negligible impact, however, as the People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong returned to the province just 4 months afterwards. Despite major operations, which the Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam would evade, the war was characterized by smaller unit engagements. The Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam would initiate 90% of large firefights, and thus the People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong would retain strategic initiative despite overwhelming United States force and firepower deployment. The People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong had developed strategies capable of countering United States doctrines and tactics. Meanwhile, South Vietnamese politics began to stabilize with the arrival of Prime Minister Air Marshal Nguyen Sao Ky and figurehead Chief of State General Nguyen Van Thieu in mid-1965. In 1967, Thieu became president with Key as his deputy after rigged elections. Though nominally a civilian government, Key was supposed to maintain real power through a behind-the-scenes military body. However, Thieu outmaneuvered and sidelined Key. Thieu was accused of murdering Key loyalists through contrived military accidents. Thieu remained president until 1975, having won a one-candidate election in 1971. Johnson employed a policy of minimum candor with the media. Military information officers sought to manage coverage by emphasizing stories that portrayed progress. This damaged public trust in official pronouncements. As coverage of the war and the Pentagon diverged, a credibility gap developed. Despite Johnson and Westmoreland proclaiming victory, and Westmoreland stating the end is coming into view, internal reports in the Pentagon Papers indicate Viet Cong forces retained strategic initiative and controlled their losses. Viet Cong attacks against static United States positions accounted for 30% of engagements. Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam ambushes and encirclements for 23%. American ambushes against Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam forces for 9%, and American forces attacking Viet Cong emplacements only 5%. In late 1967, the People's Army of Vietnam lured American forces into the hinterlands at Doc 2 and at the Marine Quai San combat base, where the United States fought the hill fights. These were part of a diversionary strategy to draw United States forces towards the Central Highlands. Preparations were underway for the Tet Offensive, with the intention of Van Tien Dung forces to launch direct attacks on the American and puppet nerve centers, Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, all the cities, towns, and main bases. Le Duan sought to placate critics of the stalemate by a decisive victory. He reasoned this could be achieved through sparking an uprising in the towns and cities, along with defections among Army of the Republic of Vietnam units who were on leave during the truce period. The Tet Offensive began in January 1968, as over 100 cities were attacked by over 85,000 Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam troops, including assaults on military installations, headquarters, and government buildings, including the United States Embassy in Saigon. United States and South Vietnamese forces were shocked by the scale, intensity, and deliberative planning, as infiltration of personnel and weapons into the cities was accomplished covertly. The offensive constituted an intelligence failure on the scale of Pearl Harbor. Most cities were recaptured within weeks, except the former imperial capital, Hue, which People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong troops held on for 26 days. They executed approximately 2,800 unarmed Hue civilians and foreigners they considered spies. In the Battle of Hue, American forces employed massive firepower that left 80% of the city in ruins. At Quang Tri City, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam Airborne Division, the 1st Division, and a United States 1st Cavalry Division regiment held out and overcame an assault intended to capture the city. In Saigon, Viet Cong and People's Army of Vietnam fighters had captured areas in and around the city, attacking key installations before United States and Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces dislodged them. Peter Arnett reported an infantry commander saying of the Battle of Ben Tre that it became necessary to destroy the village in order to save it. During the first month of Tet, 1,100 American and Allied troops, 2,100 Army of the Republic of Vietnam, and 14,000 civilians were killed. After 2 months, 5,000 Army of the Republic of Vietnam and 4,000 United States forces had been killed and 46,000 wounded. The United States claimed 17,000 People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong had been killed and 15,000 wounded. A month later, the May Offensive was launched. It demonstrated the Viet Cong were still capable of orchestrating nationwide offensives. 2 months later, the Phase 3 offensive was launched. People's Army of Vietnam losses across the offensives was 45,267 killed and 179 total casualties. It had become the bloodiest year up to then. The failure to spark a general uprising and lack of defections among the Army of the Republic of Vietnam units meant Hanoi's goals had failed at enormous cost. Prior to Tet, in November 1967, Westmoreland had spearheaded a public relations drive for the Johnson administration to bolster flagging public support. In a speech to the National Press Club, he said, "The end comes into view." Thus, the public was shocked and confused by the Tet offensive. Public approval of his performance dropped from 48% to 36%, and endorsement for the war fell from 40% to 26%. The public turned against Johnson as the offenses contradicted claims of progress. During 1968, Westmoreland considered the use of nuclear weapons in a contingency plan codenamed Fracture Jaw, which was abandoned when it became known to the White House. Westmoreland requested 200,000 additional troops, which was leaked to the media, and the fallout combined with intelligence failures caused him to be removed in March 1968, succeeded by his deputy, Creighton Abrams. On May 13, 1968, peace talks began between the United States and North Vietnam in Paris. Negotiations stagnated for 5 months, until Johnson halted the bombing of North Vietnam. Hanoi realized it could not achieve a total victory, and employed a strategy known as talking while fighting, fighting while talking, in which offensives occurred concurrently with negotiations. Johnson declined to run for re-election as his approval rating slumped from 48% to 36%. His escalation of the war divided Americans, cost 30,000 American lives by that point, and was regarded to have destroyed his presidency. Refusal to send more troops was seen as Johnson's admission. The war was lost. As McNamara said, the dangerous illusion of victory by the United States was therefore dead. Vietnam was a major issue during the United States presidential election in 1968. The election was won by Republican Richard Nixon, who claimed to have a secret plan to end the war. Nixon began troop withdrawals in 1969. His plan to build up the Army of the Republic of Vietnam so it could take over defense of South Vietnam became known as Vietnamization. As the People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong recovered from their 1968 losses and avoided contact, Abrams conducted operations aimed at disrupting logistics, with better use of firepower and more cooperation with the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. In October 1969, Nixon had ordered B-52s with nuclear weapons to race to the border of Soviet airspace to convince the Soviets, in accordance with the madman theory, he was capable of anything to end the war. Nixon had sought détente with the Soviet Union and rapprochement with China, which decreased tensions and led to nuclear arms reductions. However, the Soviets continued to supply North Vietnam. On September 2, 1969, Ho Chi Minh died. The failure of the Tet Offensive to spark an uprising in the South caused a shift in Hanoi's war strategy, and the Giap Trinh Northern First faction regained control over military affairs from the Le Duan Hoang Van Thai Southern First faction. An unconventional victory was sidelined in favor of conventional through conquest. Large-scale offensives were rolled back in favor of small unit and sapper attacks, as well as targeting the pacification and Vietnamization strategy. Following Tet, the People's Army of Vietnam had transformed from a light infantry, limited mobility force into high mobility and mechanized combined arms. The anti-war movement was gaining strength in the United States. Nixon appealed to the silent majority, who he said supported the war. But revelations of the 1968 My Lai massacre, in which a United States Army unit raped and killed civilians, and the 1969 Green Beret affair, where Special Forces soldiers were arrested for the murder of a suspected double agent, provoked outrage. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers were leaked to the New York Times. The Secret History of United States Involvement, commissioned by the Department of Defense, detailed public deceptions by the government. The Supreme Court ruled publication legal. Following Tet and decreasing public support, United States forces began a period of morale collapse and disobedience. At home, desertion rates quadrupled from 1966 levels. Among the enlisted, only 2.5% chose infantry between 1969 and 1970. ROTC enrollment decreased from 91,700 in 1966 to 70,459 by 1971, and a low of 30,220 in 1974, depriving the United States of much-needed military leadership. Refusal to engage in patrols or carry out orders emerged, with a case of an entire company refusing orders. Unit cohesion began to dissipate, and focused on minimizing contact with the People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong. A practice known as sandbagging started, where units ordered to patrol would go into the countryside, find a site out of view from superiors, and radio in false coordinates and reports. Drug usage increased. 30% regularly used marijuana, while a House subcommittee found 10% used heroin. From 1969, search and destroy operations became referred to as search and avoid, falsifying battle reports while avoiding guerrillas. 800 fragging, killing a fellow officer, usually superior, and suspected fragging incidents were investigated, most occurring between 1969 and 1971. In 1969, field performance was characterized by low morale and poor leadership. The decline in morale was demonstrated by the Battle of FSB Mary Ann in 1971, in which a sapper attack inflicted serious losses on United States defenders. Westmoreland, no longer in command, but tasked with investigation of the failure, cited dereliction of duty, lax defensive postures, and lack of officers in charge. On the collapse of morale, Shelby Stanton wrote, "In the last years of the Army's retreat, its remaining forces were relegated to static security." The American Army's decline was readily apparent. Racial incidents, drug abuse, combat disobedience, and crime reflected growing idleness, resentment, and the fatal handicaps of faulty campaign strategy, incomplete wartime preparation, and the tardy, superficial attempts at Vietnamization. An entire American army was sacrificed on the battlefield of Vietnam. Beginning in 1969, American troops were withdrawn from border areas where most of the fighting took place and redeployed along the coast and interior. United States casualties in 1970 were less than half of 1969, after being relegated to less active combat. While United States forces were redeployed, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam took over combat operations, with casualties double United States ones in 1969 and triple in 1970. Post-Het. Membership in the South Vietnamese regional forces and popular force militias grew, and they could now provide village security, which the Americans had not accomplished. In 1970, Nixon announced the withdrawal of an additional 150,000 American troops, reducing United States numbers to 265,000. By 1970, Viet Cong forces were no longer Southern majority. Nearly 70% were Northerners. Between 1969 and 1971, the Viet Cong and some People's Army of Vietnam units had reverted to small unit tactics instead of nationwide offensives. In 1971, Australia and New Zealand withdrew their soldiers, and United States troops were reduced to 96,700, with a deadline to remove another 45,000 troops by February 1972. The United States reduced support troops, and in March 1971 the 5th Special Forces Group, the first American unit deployed, withdrew. Prince Norodom Sihanouk had proclaimed Cambodia neutral since 1955, but permitted the People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong to use the port of Sihanoukville and Sihanouk Trail. In March 1969, Nixon launched a secret bombing campaign called Operation Menu against communist sanctuaries along the Cambodia-Vietnam border. Only 5 congressional officials were informed. In March 1970, Sihanouk was deposed by his pro-American Prime Minister Lon Nol, who demanded North Vietnamese troops leave Cambodia or face military action. Nol began rounding up Vietnamese civilians in Cambodia and massacring them, provoking reactions from the North and South Vietnamese governments. In April-May 1970, North Vietnam invaded Cambodia at the request of the Khmer Rouge, following negotiations with Deputy Leader Nguyen Chea. Nguyen Co Thach recalls, Nguyen Chea has asked for help, and we have liberated 5 provinces of Cambodia in 10 days. United States and Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces launched the Cambodian campaign in May to attack People's Army of Vietnam and Viet Cong bases. A counter-offensive in 1971, as part of Operation Chen Le II by the People's Army of Vietnam, recaptured most border areas and decimated Nguyen's forces. The United States incursion into Cambodia sparked U.S. protests as Nixon had promised to de-escalate involvement. 4 students were killed by National Guardsmen in May 1970 at a Kent State University protest, which provoked further outrage. The administration's reaction was seen as callous, reinvigorating the anti-war movement. The United States continued to bomb Cambodia as part of Operation Freedom Deal. Building on the success of Army of the Republic of Vietnam units in Cambodia and further testing the Vietnamization program, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam was tasked with Operation Lam Son 7 and 19 in February 1971, the first major ground operation to attack the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This was the first time the People's Army of Vietnam would field test its combined arms force. The first few days were a success, but momentum slowed after fierce resistance. Thieu had halted the general advance, leaving People's Army of Vietnam armored divisions able to surround them. Thieu ordered air assault troops to capture the Chiaponne crossroad and withdraw, despite facing 4 times larger numbers. During the withdrawal, the People's Army of Vietnam counterattack had forced a panicked rout. Half of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops were either captured or killed. Half the Army of the Republic of Vietnam and United States support helicopters were downed, and the operation was a fiasco, demonstrating operational deficiencies within the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Nixon and Thieu had sought a showcase victory simply by capturing Chi Chi Pon, and it was spun off as an operational success. Vietnamization was again tested by the Easter Offensive of 1972, a conventional People's Army of Vietnam invasion of South Vietnam. The People's Army of Vietnam overran the northern provinces and attacked from Cambodia, threatening to cut the country in half. United States troop withdrawals continued, but American air power responded, beginning Operation Linebacker, and the offensive was halted. The United States Navy initiated Operation Pocket Money in May, an aerial mining campaign in Haiphong Harbor that prevented North Vietnam's allies from resupplying it with weapons. The war was central to the 1972 U.S. presidential election as Nixon's opponent, George McGovern, campaigned on immediate withdrawal. Nixon's security advisor, Henry Kissinger, had continued secret negotiations with North Vietnam's Le Duc Dau, and in October 1972 reached an agreement. Thieu demanded changes to the peace accord upon its discovery, and when North Vietnam went public with the details, the Nixon administration claimed they were attempting to embarrass the president. The negotiations became deadlocked when Hanoi demanded changes. To show his support for South Vietnam and force Hanoi back to the negotiating table, Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker II, a bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong in December. Nixon pressured Thieu to accept the agreement or face military action. On January 15, 1973, all United States combat activities were suspended. Le Duc Dau and Henry Kissinger, along with the PRG Foreign Minister Nguyen Thi Binh and a reluctant Thieu, signed the Paris Peace Accords on January 27. This ended direct U.S. involvement in the war, created a ceasefire between North Vietnam and PRG, and South Vietnam guaranteed the territorial integrity of Vietnam under the Geneva Conference, called for elections or a political settlement between the PRG and South Vietnam, allowed 200,000 communist troops to remain in the South, and agreed to a POW exchange. There was a 60-day period for the withdrawal of United States forces. This article proved to be the only one which was fully carried out. All United States Forces personnel were withdrawn by March 29. In the lead-up to the ceasefire on January 28, both sides attempted to maximize land and population under their control in a campaign known as the War of the Flags. Fighting continued after the ceasefire, without United States participation, and throughout the year. North Vietnam was allowed to continue supplying troops in the South, but only to replace expended material. The Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Kissinger and Thiers, but Thiers declined, saying peace did not yet exist. On March 15, 1973, Nixon implied the United States would intervene militarily if the North launched a full offensive, and Defense Secretary Schlesinger reaffirmed this during his confirmation hearings. Public and congressional reaction was unfavorable, prompting the Senate to pass the Case-Church Amendment to prohibit intervention. Northern leaders expected the ceasefire terms would favor their side, but Saigon, bolstered by a surge of United States aid just before the ceasefire, began to roll them back. The North responded with a new strategy developed in March 1973, according to Tran Van Tra. With United States bombing suspended, work on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and other logistical structures could proceed. Logistics would be upgraded until the North was in a position to launch a massive invasion of the South, projected for the 1975-76 dry season. Trey calculated this would be Hanoi's last opportunity to strike, before Saigon's army could be fully trained. The People's Army of Vietnam resumed offensive operations when the dry season began in 1973, and by January 1974 had recaptured territory lost during the previous dry season. In South Vietnam, the United States' departure and recession after the 1973 oil crisis hurt an economy dependent on United States support and troop presence. After clashes that left 25,000 Army of the Republic of Vietnam soldiers dead, Thieu announced in January 1974 that the war had restarted and the peace accords were no longer in effect. There were over 25,000 South Vietnamese casualties during the ceasefire period. Gerald Ford took over as United States President in August 1974, and Congress cut financial aid to South Vietnam from $2.3 billion to $700 million. Congress voted funding restrictions to be phased in through 1975 and total cutoff in 1976. The success of the 1973 dry season offensive inspired Tra to return to Hanoi in October 1974 and plead for a larger offensive the next dry season. This time, Tra could travel on a drivable highway with fueling stops, a vast change from when the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a dangerous mountain trek. Giap, the North Vietnamese defense minister, was reluctant to approve Tra's plan since a large offensive might provoke United States reaction and interfere with the big push planned for 1976. Tra appealed to Giap's superior, Le Duan, who approved it. Tra's plan called for a limited offensive from Cambodia into Phuoc Long province. The strike was designed to solve logistical problems, gauge the reaction of South Vietnamese forces, and determine whether the United States would return. On December 13, 1974, People's Army of Vietnam forces attacked Phuoc Long. Phuoc Binh fell on January 6, 1975. Ford desperately asked Congress for $300 million in funds to assist and resupply the South before it was overrun. Congress refused. The fall of Phuoc Binh and lack of American response left the South Vietnamese elite demoralized. The speed of this success led the Politburo to reassess. It decided operations in the Central Highlands would be turned over to General Van Tien Dung and Pleiku should be seized, if possible. Dung said to Le Duan, "Never have we had military and political conditions so perfect or a strategic advantage as great as we have now." At the start of 1975, the South Vietnamese had 3 times as much artillery and twice as many tanks and armored vehicles as the People's Army of Vietnam. However, heightened oil prices meant many assets could not be used. Moreover, the rushed nature of Vietnamization, intended to cover United States retreat, resulted in lack of spare parts, ground crew, and maintenance personnel, which rendered most of it inoperable. On March 10, 1975, Deng launched Campaign 275, a limited offensive into the Central Highlands, supported by tanks and heavy artillery. The target was Ban Ma Thuo. If the town could be taken, the provincial capital, Pleiku, and the road to the coast would be exposed for a campaign in 1976. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam proved incapable of resisting, its forces collapsed. Again, Hanoi was surprised by the speed of its success. Deng urged the Politburo to allow him to seize Pleiku immediately and turn his attention to Kon Tum. He argued that with 2 months of good weather until the monsoon, it would be irresponsible not to take advantage. Few ordered the abandonment of the Central Highlands and less defensible positions in a rushed policy described as light at the top, heavy at the bottom. While most Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces attempted to flee, isolated units fought desperately. Army of the Republic of Vietnam General Phu abandoned Plaik and Kon Tum and retreated toward the coast in the Convoy of Tears. On March 19, Thieu reversed himself and ordered Hue, Vietnam's third largest city, held at all costs, and then changed policy several times. As the People's Army of Vietnam attacked, panic set in, and Army of the Republic of Vietnam resistance withered. On March 26, the People's Army of Vietnam attacked Hue. Civilians flooded the airport and docks, hoping to escape. As resistance in Hue collapsed, People's Army of Vietnam rockets rained down onto Nang and its airport. By March 28, 35,000 People's Army of Vietnam troops were poised to attack the suburbs. By March 30th, 100,000 leaderless Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops surrendered as the People's Army of Vietnam marched through Da Nang. With the fall of the city, the defense of the Central Highlands and northern provinces ended. With the north half of the country under their control, the Politburo ordered Deng to launch the final offensive. The operational plan for the Ho Chi Minh campaign called for Saigon's capture before the May 1 monsoon season. Hanoi wished to avoid the monsoon and prevent redeployment of Army of the Republic of Vietnam forces defending the capital. People's Army of Vietnam forces, their morale boosted by recent victories, rolled on, taking Nha Trang, Cam Ranh, and Dalat. On April 9, 3 People's Army of Vietnam divisions attacked Xuan Liqui, 40 miles northeast of Saigon. Fighting raged as the Army of the Republic of Vietnam defenders made a last stand to block People's Army of Vietnam advance. On April 21, however, the exhausted garrison was ordered to withdraw towards Saigon. An embittered and tearful Thieu resigned, declaring that the United States had betrayed South Vietnam. He suggested Kissinger had tricked him into signing the Paris Accords, promising military aid that failed to materialize. Having transferred power to Trinh Vien Hong on April 21, he left for Taiwan. After having appealed unsuccessfully to Congress for $722 million in emergency military aid, Ford gave a speech on April 23 declaring an end to the Vietnam War as far as America was concerned. On April 27, 100,000 North Vietnamese troops encircled Saigon. The city was defended by 30,000 Army of the Republic of Vietnam troops. On April 30th, the last U.S. Marine helicopter left the roof of the American embassy, and the evacuation was complete. North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace, and North Vietnamese Colonel B. Thien accepted the surrender of South Vietnam from President Duong Van Minh. Minh announced the unconditional surrender of South Vietnamese forces on Radio Saigon. North Vietnamese forces entered the city and took control of all government installations. The Vietnam War had ended. The Vietnam War was a defining conflict of the Cold War era that reshaped American foreign policy and had profound consequences for all nations involved. The war demonstrated the limitations of military power in achieving political objectives and highlighted the importance of understanding local dynamics in international conflicts. Its legacy continues to influence American military doctrine and foreign policy decisions to this day, serving as a cautionary tale about the complexities of intervention in civil conflicts and the challenges of nation building in foreign lands.